In the late Middle Ages, towns began to grow in northern Italy. The Crusades and the Mongol Empire fostered long-distance trade. The plague drove up wages due to the demand for labor. In the 1300s, Florence in northern Italy rose into an important center for the manufacturing of wool cloth. Florence was an important city-state with a republican form of government. Remember, the republican form of government is what the Roman Republic had, where you have elements of democracy, but it's a representative style of government. Wealthy merchants and artisans dominated the government. In the 1400s, political independence and guild regulation turns Florence into an economic center. The Medici family established banks in Florence with branches in Flanders and London. These banks innovated by including checking accounts and lending. Those kind of sound like normal things that banks do now. Florence saw the development of shareholding companies. Shareholding companies are really innovative for whenever you need to do projects with a lot of capital. For example, with a shareholding company, if I want to sell a ship to trade goods, instead of me just owning the ship and the ship going down and me losing all that money, I can own the ship with 20 different people. That way, if the ship goes down, I've only lost 1/20th of a ship. It really does help with large capital type investments during this time. Florence accumulated vast amounts of wealth. So for the most part, the city was shadow ruled by the Medici family, like not officially ruled by the Medici family, but they really pulled the strings of power. Remember, the Greeks would have called this an oligarchy. The vast wealth held by the residents of Florence funded major cultural developments in art and architecture. During this time, too, there was a movement where people began to move back to trying to create things that looked like Greece and Rome. So during the medieval period, works of art were commissioned by the church and was limited to depictions from the Bible. During the Renaissance, wealthy patrons in Italy began to pay for high-quality works inspired by a new approach to the arts. Artists like Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci found inspiration in the Greek and Roman use of realism. This led to artistic techniques like perspective and shading. If you take an art class, you'll learn some of these basics that were just pretty much lost during the medieval period. So let's go through a few Renaissance artwork examples. Da Vinci's Mona Lisa on the left conveys human emotion, movement, space in a way that has never been done before. You would not see anything like this in the medieval period as far as paintings go. Da Vinci made a lot of models he theoretically thought could be made into machines, and his models, some of them look like straight up airplanes, some of them look like helicopters. It's interesting. He also would make sketches of the human body whenever he would illegally dissect corpses just to know what the human body looked like, and they're also very accurate. It is interesting to look at his sketchbooks because it really is like looking at the mind of a genius. Raphael's School of Athens conveys human emotion, movement, and space in a way that had never been quite done before. The School of Athens has all these figures throughout history. For example, that's Socrates and Plato talking to each other. And then there's all these figures through history leading all the way up until Raphael's time that he painted into the painting. And you can also see the use of perspective where there's depth to the photo. Like you can see the depth from the first column to the second column. I still can't take him too serious though because he painted himself in his own painting. Michelangelo's David depicted muscle tone, bone structure, and emotion in marble. That's carved from a rock. That's impressive. Michelangelo also painted the Sistine Chapel, or the roof of the Sistine Chapel you've probably seen before, where there's an image of God reaching out to man. Literature also changed during this time period, though I think this is a much more vague movement. For example, this guy lived in the 1200s while this guy lived in the 1600s, and it's supposed to be the same literary movement. Essentially, what they're trying to highlight is whenever writers began writing in the vernacular or writing in their own language instead of writing in Latin. Also, it's characterized by a transition into writing about more emotional things and more secular themes, not always so religious. The big focus you'll see through the Renaissance painting, that's a return to how the Greeks and the Romans viewed their world as a return to realism, and also an appreciation for the human body and believing that the human body itself is perfect. Medieval intellectual study was dominated by the study of the Bible and the pursuit for salvation. Just think how the Pope was able to get hundreds of thousands of people to march on crusade just by promising them salvation. Many intellectuals of the Renaissance remained devoutly Catholic, but also pursued secular themes. Humanists argued that the faithful could live an enjoyable life full of worldly pleasures without offending God. Essentially, you could enjoy yourself and not spend your whole life in misery while repenting sin. Humanists were inspired by the Greek classics and focused on the study of history, literature, and philosophy. The movement idealized intellectual curiosity and celebrated human achievement. Now remember, this isn't like a rejection of religion, it's just the idea that you can still have religion but also pursue secular endeavors. Okay, so movable type was actually developed in China but wasn't widely used. It's also hard to have movable type whenever you have 10,000 characters in the entire language. You need like 2,000 just to get by, and 10,000 is the entire language in depth. Print technology and paper making was diffused to Europe. 1454, Johann Gutenberg completes the first Gutenberg Bible, which is the first book printed in Europe. The Gutenberg Bible is special because it was printed in German. Before this, monks had to write Bibles by hand. This made the Bible widely available in German to many people for the first time. So your entire population could now read the Bible. Think about that. People had gone hundreds of years in Christianity without being able to read the Bible, and they sat in church every Sunday. By 1500, 10 million books were printed. The printing boom contributed to an increase in literacy, the growth of humanism, and the Protestant Reformation. As I hope that I have conveyed, during the Middle Ages, the Latin Catholic Church wielded political power across Europe. They were arguably the most powerful institution across the entire continent. The Renaissance emphasis on individualism and secularism led to religious strife. Some Catholic clergy began to live lavish lifestyles from the church. The clergy had wealth from church tithes, rents, collected from church lands, and business ventures operated by Catholic monasteries. Remember, the Catholic Church governed many parts of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Pope had his own little country. There was the thing called the Papal State. Inside of these Catholic lands, they're able to keep every bit of the taxes they collect. Remember that map of the Holy Roman Empire I showed y'all, and how a bunch of little dots of the land were controlled by the church? That means in those lands, the lord of the fief would be the bishop. So it wouldn't be like hereditary, but whoever the bishop was the person who got to collect all the taxes. During this time, you also see just an explosion of corruption. And you began to see situations where popes would openly have affairs with women, which was not supposed to happen. They weren't supposed to be married, much less have affairs. 1517, Pope Leo authorized the sale of indulgences to rebuild St. Peter's Cathedral. An indulgence gave people the impression they could purchase a free pass to heaven. It really is that corrupt. You would spend about 1 year of salary, roughly, for your average person, and in exchange, you would get a slip of paper that said that you had guaranteed salvation because you helped build the cathedral. Even the modern Catholic Church will tell you today this is one of the darkest stains upon Catholicism, was the sale of indulgences. In October of 1517, Martin Luther, a monk provoked by the sale of indulgences, posted his 95 Theses on the door of his church in Wittenberg, Germany. The Theses were taken to a printer and circulated widely throughout the German state. The 95 Theses were a summary of all the complaints and all the problems that Luther saw with the church, mainly focusing on the sale of indulgences. That was his biggest gripe. The 95 Theses were remarkable. You had seen people openly criticize the church like this, but most of them had A, been burned at the stake very quickly, and also B, did not have the means to produce and replicate what they were protesting against in wide circulation. Luther was able to circulate his ideas because of the printing press. He happened to live in one of the German states where the prince was willing to rebel against the Catholic Church, and he also lived in the German state where the printing press was invented. That kind of helped. With the political protection of where Luther lived, he was able to continue to preach against the church. Luther quickly gained a vast following, undermining the authority of the church. Luther argued that Christians could win forgiveness with faith alone, and the only one true source of religious truth was the Bible. So if you grew up with a Protestant Christian background, this will probably start to sound more familiar to the way that you think of religion. Luther essentially said that you don't have to go through all the church ritual in order to have salvation. Luther was eventually excommunicated and solidified the birth of Lutheranism. Remember, this isn't the first time you see a breakaway from the Catholic Church. First one we talked about was the Schism of 1054, whenever the Orthodox Church in Constantinople separated with Rome. Much of northern Germany and Scandinavia would become Lutheran. A lot of rulers of those small principalities in the Holy Roman Empire were really happy because they were able to confiscate all the church property in their territory. Remember, one of the only sources of wealth people have is land. So you could literally take some of that church property if you were the ruler of an area and sell it in order to make some money. And you can also say it's because of a true religious belief. 1536, not long after Luther, John Calvin publishes the Institutions of the Christian Religion. Calvin developed a theology that humanity was sinful by nature and that God predetermined who would achieve eternal salvation. Calvin argued that the elect, people chosen by God for heaven, should come together and form a utopian community free of sin. The Presbyterians of Scotland, the Huguenots of France, and the Puritans of England were all born out of Calvin's theology. So in the beginning of the Reformation, you see the emergence of Lutheranism and Calvinism, which both emerged in the Holy Roman Empire and both had plenty of support in different communities where the leaders were willing to rebel against the Catholic Church. There are so many modern Protestant denominations that are descended from Calvinism. In the 1500s, the Tudor dynasty came to power in England after a civil war that resulted from the lack of male heirs. Henry VII wanted to avoid the problems that led to the War of the Roses. Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon after 18 years and no male heir. 1527, Henry asked the Pope for an annulment, but the Pope refuses. For context, Catherine of Aragon is from Aragon, which is one of the kingdoms that'll create Spain. Castile and Aragon were the two kingdoms that created Spain. Like Columbus technically sailed for Castile, not Spain. It's like out of everybody Henry could have made mad here, this is one of the worst he could have done because this is one of the most prominent Catholic kingdoms in Europe at the time. I can't state how big a deal this was because originally he claimed the Pope was superior to him. This oath that kings would take from time to time, he even had a title given to him by the Pope that was like Defender of the Faith. None of these things are really that big a deal practically. Just understand, before he asked for this annulment, him and the church were tight. In 1533, Henry divorced Catherine and married Anne Boleyn. Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, making Henry the head of the Church of England and ending association with the Catholic Church. Just to summarize, the Church of England was established because Henry was not allowed to divorce one of his wives. Oh yeah, by the way, after this, Henry would divorce like 3 or 4 more wives. He was angry and thought that it was always the women's fault that he couldn't have a male heir. Eventually, he did have a male heir. The Catholic Church responded to the Reformation with the Counter-Reformation, with the goals to clarify church doctrine, increase membership, and to curb corruption. In 1534, the Pope authorized the creation of the Jesuits to establish a network of schools that improved the quality of the clergy. You'll still see Jesuit schools around today. 1545, the Council of Trent creates a unified response to the Reformation. So the Catholics had to respond to the Reformation in order to stop the rapid growth of the Reformation. It really freaked out the church how quickly all these places in Northern Europe became Protestant. The Council of Trent concluded that Catholic clergy's interpretation of the Bible was final and that faith alone was not enough for salvation. So in the end, they disagreed with Luther's entire premise. But they said church doctrine was equal to the Bible and a source of religious truth. The Council of Trent did acknowledge that corruption was a problem. In the end, the Counter-Reformation slowed the spread of the Protestant Reformation and secured Catholicism in Southern Europe. They also explicitly denounced the use of indulgences. So the Counter-Reformation was successful at slowing the spread of Protestantism. Most places that would become Protestant in Europe were already Protestant by the Council of Trent. But just so you know, we go from this map where everything in gray and white is Catholic to this map where all those various places are Protestant. In a very short period of time, the Catholic Church lost all this land just in the span of like 20 years. I can't stress how big a deal the Reformation was.